wave for our webcasting, and there we are. Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Jennifer Dill. I'm a faculty member here in Urban Studies and Planning and Director of the Center for Transportation Studies, which sponsors this weekly seminar we have on Fridays at noon. I have some colleagues who help organize it with me, Chris Monsieur, Rob Bertini, and John Glebe. And I want to, in case you are new to the seminar, let you know that we do webcast all of the seminars, so people can be watching on the web live. You can also watch later, but since you were here, maybe you won't need to do that. But we also have a few years' worth of seminars archived on the web, so you can go back and look at sort of the best hits of the past if you so desire. But one thing about the webcasting that you need to know is that you need to use the microphone if you ask a question, and hold the touch button and keep the red light lit while you're asking the question so that the people on the web can hear the question. Because if they can't hear the question, they send me angry emails saying, tell people to use the microphones. So I will often remind you, if for some reason there is no microphone near you or it doesn't work, I will try to come around with this portable one so we can record your question. So with all that logistic stuff's taken care of, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker for the day, Matthew Kitchen. He is a transportation planner for the Puget Sound Regional Council, and here he was here maybe a couple years ago talking about this project before it was completed, and now he's going to inform us about some of the results, which I've been anxious to hear about. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks very much. I did get a chance to watch online Tony's presentation last week, so this seems to sort of complete a theme here on experiments with road charging. And so what I plan to do is provide some background about the project that we've been working on over the last 5 years up in the Seattle area called the Traffic Choices Study, and then only spend a little bit of time on the background and hopefully cover mostly the kinds of behavioral findings that we have been able to uncover, and then touch on some of the implications of those findings for obviously for policy. This is a fairly formal environment, but I'm fairly informal, so I will try and, I think there's no alternative but for me to basically speak for a bit of time and then have the questions. But please, if there is a pressing issue that needs clarification as I go, don't hesitate to sort of wave your hands wildly, and we'll try and I'll gladly stop talking for a while and let some other people ask those questions. So. Just to get us started. There we go. Talk a little bit about what this project is. So a number of years ago, about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when we were updating our regional plan up in the Seattle region, in the Puget Sound, we really spent a bit of time on long-range finance issues. It was pretty clear, it's been clear, frankly, for many decades, but it's increasingly clear what the sorts of problems are especially in highway finance. And we decided that we needed to do something to sort of advance some understanding of what road pricing opportunities were in terms of helping to solve the finance issues and also deal with the kinds of chronic congestion issues that we face in the central Puget Sound. And it was really important for us, we thought, to start collecting some information that would allow us to understand user behavior, because frankly there are almost no controlled environments in which you can understand behavioral response to tolls. Even tolled projects don't offer you the opportunity to understand what the response is in any meaningful or detailed way unless you happen to be smart enough to collect the right kind of information before you implemented a toll project, and collect the right kind of information after you implement a toll project. That almost never happens. So the only real environments we have currently to observe some sort of detailed user behavior is in the kinds of experiments that have gone on in hot lanes in California and elsewhere, where you have a discrete opportunity to observe the choice of drivers as they make that choice right on the roadway. So our objective was to collect a detailed body of information about driver response when we expose those drivers to a fairly ubiquitous set of toll conditions as they use the roadway network. Now, to do that is a challenge. So we had to figure out exactly how to expose these folks who we were going to recruit to be part of this study to tolled conditions. And standard toll collection technology, even the most sorts of advanced electronic toll collection systems, essentially rely upon an extensive amount of roadway equipment and a very small amount then of equipment in the vehicle. And that's prohibitively expensive for any kind of experimental setting. So, and frankly, we knew what was happening in sort of the advanced areas of electronic toll collection, mostly in Europe, examining toll systems that were oriented around GPS technology. And so we thought this was an opportunity both to help us with our experimental problem, but also to do some small steps towards advancing the understanding of the deployment of that kind of equipment in some kind of a practical setting. And of course, without question, there are key sets of policy questions that we wanted to better understand as it would relate to any kind of broader application of tolling. So essentially what we did is we recruited households from our region. They were randomly selected, but from an enriched pool of potential participants. And we can talk in some detail about that, but essentially we had to have participants who would be meaningfully involved in the experiment. We couldn't have households that, for instance, didn't own vehicles. That would have been kind of nonsensical. So we certainly had to go through an enrichment process, but we did that with a very broad call list of about 250,000 households from our region. So we, I think, called about 180,000 of those folks to get our participant base. So once we had these folks sort of committed to what they understood to be a year-plus long experiment, without much information that we provided them about how that would actually unfold. It's amazing how cooperative people actually are. I don't think I would have been willing to sign up for something where I didn't know fully what was going on. But we instrumented their vehicles with the tolling device, which in a moment I'll say a little something about. But and then we just sort of let them loose and collected baseline data on these folks for about 6 months, depending on the household. And then with that baseline data, we were able to uniquely craft for each household a travel budget, where that travel budget would be approximately exhausted over the course of the remainder of the experiment if they didn't modify their behavior, given the set of toll rates that we were going to be exposing them to. So each household had a unique budget. Each household essentially then had a unique set of financial incentives with which to then make decisions about how they economized in terms of spending those resources on tolls. At the end of the project, then, of course, the deal was they would keep whatever's left in their account balance. So once we'd finished doing this baseline data collection, really we got them all together for the first time to fully explain everything, and then that's when we sort of laid out the rest of this for them. They were provided access to account information through an online user account. They were explained how the mechanics of the project would work. They were explained what the toll rates would be. And then we had 10 months, approximately 10 months of actual toll collection. The tolling device, you can barely see it in that picture, which is probably good because it's funny, after we were done with the experiment, we gave these folks an opportunity to tell us anything they didn't like about our project, and probably the most, the thing that was mentioned most was the the fact that this toll device was pretty ugly, and it is kind of ugly, but there are new generations of this. But it sits on the dashboard. It's got a GPS chipset in it. It has the toll rates embedded in a base map, digital base map that's in the device. The GPS positions are associated with the roads in the road network and the toll rates, and then the information is sent to a back office through the cellular network, and is also displayed. Basic information about the tolls that are being incurred is displayed in the display that's a two-line display there on the device. This gives a little sort of basic sense of how that works. The data is sent, as I said, through the cellular network back to a central office. Then everybody who's involved in the project, including the participants, has access to back office, the appropriate portions of the back office through web interface. This is basically the same technology this is the same in-vehicle device that's being used, or has been used in Germany. One of the two devices being used in the heavy vehicle tolling system in Germany. It's a Siemens device. Frankly, there are lots of variants on this, but they all basically do the same thing. So, what were we trying to understand is understanding what we're trying to understand is important to have a good concept of what the toll objective is. And so, the toll objective that we were exposing these folks to was that they would pay the costs that they impose on other users in terms of the time delay that they impose on all the other users in the network. So it's theoretically, it's an economically efficient toll, but of course those kinds of toll rates are, since they're dependent upon loadings on the road network, tend to be fairly complex. So in the hot lane context, you can permit a fair amount of complexity because you have a single portion of a corridor to toll. But in a network, you can't permit that kind of complexity without overwhelming the user to the point where the price information is no longer meaningful. So we obviously had to abstract from the theoretically optimal toll rates. And we had to do that in a way that would assist us in actually understanding user behavior. Now, this is in an experimental setting. This is not a problem. This problem that we tried to solve doesn't have to be fully resolved for us to be able to observe behavior. In the real world, if you were implementing a toll system like this, it would be kind of important if you were over-tolling, say, one direction of a freeway corridor and under-tolling another direction. That would be certainly a public relations issue you would want to try and resolve. But our solution was to have essentially two types of roads. Pretty straightforward. The freeway network was tolled at one rate, and the arterial network was tolled at another rate. And then the dimension that we wanted to retain variability in was, of course, time of day to the greatest extent. And so we had 5 time periods: an AM peak commute period, essentially a PM commute period, a midday, an evening, and a nighttime. Nighttime was no toll. So if, as an example, if you were traveling on the freeway network in the afternoon, you were paying 50 cents a mile. The arterials were always half that rate of the freeway network. And then we did have a weekend toll structure as well. That was different because our loadings, frankly, and our network are different in the weekends than they are on the weekdays. The main point here is that we needed to keep this understandable to users, otherwise the price signal doesn't do what it's intended to do. So this is the solution that we employed. We, in essence, we operated a toll system for essentially about 18 months. And important caveats there is that there were some of the most complex aspects of toll operations we certainly did not implement. We didn't have any kind of enforcement program. We had friendly participants. We didn't actually collect money. If you don't have to touch money, everything's a lot easier. Now, we actually distributed money, so but we didn't have to try and collect money from anybody. But other than that, all the other aspects essentially of toll operation we implemented. We had the back office fully operational. We had a customer service center. We fielded customer service calls, numerous calls. We issued invoices monthly to these participants. We had thousands of communication transactions between these remote devices and the central system. So and over 18 months, essentially all the dimensions of that kind of operation get pretty well tested. We also did some household surveys and focus groups to support some of the basic research. But and so these folks also had lots of different ways to get information about the tolls that they were paying. So as I said, they had monthly invoices, but they also could at any point log on to their account and find out exactly what they had spent over any period of time. They could look at individual trips. They could look at the details of individual trips to actually see toll segments where they had paid individual tolls on a very small portion of the network. So they had a lot of detail available to them if they wanted to use it. And they also had direct feedback in the device itself, which showed the road they were on, the name of the road they were on, the toll rate per mile for that road, and then it showed a running total for that, the tolls that they were incurring over the course of that trip. So, needless to say, we ended up with quite a lot of data, and Carl and Gio are here, and Eco Northwest was instrumental in all this work. And so, when it came down to wrangling this data, they're the ones who did it. But we ended up, I think, with about 750,000 trip records, which was probably over 200, maybe 220 tours. And so a tour, because we were interested in behavior specifically, and where we believe that behavior varies across a number of dimensions, including trip purpose, we wanted to turn individual trips into tours to associate that trip activity with some purpose. And the best way for us to do this is we had unambiguous information about their home location and their work location, essentially. And so those became the points upon which we were constructing tours. So this just illustrates how one constructs a tour. So in this example, this trip starts at the work location at the end of the day. It makes, there's an intermediary stop, and then a second intermediary stop, and then a final segment to that tour to end up at the home location. Now, in our trip records, of course, those are 3 trips, but 1 tour, and that's a work to home tour in our lexicon, if you will. Yeah. We have a question.
If somebody wanted to take transit, could they use their travel account to take transit and then you track those trips?
No, if they take transit, the question is if they take transit, how does that relate to their account? If they take transit, they are obviously avoiding making a vehicle trip and thus preserving some portion of their account. And so, in essence, by preserving some of their income, I guess you could say they can use that towards taking a transit trip. But we're ignorant of that. We don't instrument, obviously, the person, only the vehicle. And so we only have vehicle information. Everything you'll see is about the vehicle use. We'll talk a little bit about because we're interested in issues of transit utilization. We'll talk a little bit about how we thought about that problem. We're collecting a huge amount of detailed information about trip behavior. Any other kind of qualitative information that we introduce to this is of extremely sort of dubious utility in comparison to the amount of the accuracy and the detail that we have about vehicle use. So you'll see a little bit later some of our thoughts about how to deal with issues of, does transit meaningfully influence the nature of the behavioral response? So this is an example of, since we have huge amounts of information, mostly you'll find organizations like mine, we need to do travel surveys to support, simply to support building travel demand models and doing other planning work. And the standard is to have sort of a 2 or 3 day diary which people fill out. And so you've got 2 or 3 day typical days, whatever a typical day is. And this is very different, of course, because we've got upwards of 18 months of data on individual households, a smaller sample, but the amount of variability in travel behavior, both across households and within households, I think was sort of surprising to most of us. And so just an example, this is across households, but we have a lot of information about the distribution of dimensions of travel, independent of the observed behavioral response to the tolls. So we have things like we can understand trip departure time and how it is distributed across these households across the day. Also about trip distance, a range of number of non-work trips made by households. You can imagine all the range of information and detail that we have. And this doesn't even begin to show you what we would know about variability within household. So that's also, of course, important. The point here is that we're only sort of scratching the surface of the usefulness of this data in our work, and we certainly will be making subsets of this data available for other researchers, because there is going to be such an interest in just independent of the toll implications, just the other aspects of travel behavior. But really, we'll talk a little bit about our analysis of the data for behavioral implications. And so, our expectations were that we would see a range of responses to the exposure to tolls, and we would see changes in a number of things like the frequency of trip making, obviously the path taken, because there were differential toll rates on different paths, the total amount of distance traveled by the vehicles in order to economize against the tolls, and shifting of time of day of trips as people may try to avoid the most costly times of travel. And we would expect larger kinds of response influenced by factors of income. Households with transit accessibility, for instance, might have a greater opportunity to avoid the tolls than households without. And these are the kinds of dimensions that we were going to be explicitly measuring. So essentially what we're doing is creating a range of elasticities of demand, both for the toll costs and then for the generalized cost of travel, where the time component of travel was part of that formulation. And where we were measuring those elasticities across different trip purposes, and then also across the different dimensions of demand. As I said, the number of tours, the tour distances, the amount of time driven, the number of segments. So in other words, what started with, which were trips and turned into tours, well, we would expect some sort of a trip chaining to occur, maybe different kinds of trip chaining to occur in response to tolls. The amount of distance traveled on the toll network as opposed to the untolled network. There was a portion of the network that simply was not tolled at all. And then, of course, start time and the amount and responsiveness in terms of the amount of tolls paid. With sort of the key explanatory factors being obviously the tolls themselves, but also controlling for household income, number of drivers per household, transit accessibility. And we tested, of course, a whole range of other explanatory variables, which were, for the most part, not particularly meaningful. These are the key ones. And before I start showing some results, there's going to be obvious questions about, we had a random selection process, but what did we end up with in terms of the household sample? Probably a little bit challenging to see, but we were able to compare to the detailed census data from the geography from which we recruited, and at the 5% sample, you can do some filtering for the enrichment process that we employed for our sample base. And essentially, we are not rejecting the null hypothesis that there's no difference between means here. In most of the cases of most of the sample characteristics that have any importance to what we're observing. So we weren't able to, we were in the position to have to reject sort of the null hypothesis, if you will, for some other explanatory, some other household characteristics like home ownership versus rental and education level. But once we've controlled for income, which is looks very good with our sample compared to the census, and household size, as we said, most of those are the important dimensions of the household that are meaningful to the econometric work that we did. And so we feel pretty good that our sample looks pretty reasonable, given that it was obviously an enriched sample. So what did we observe? What I'm going to show you is these are elasticities of demand, and they are in regards to the toll cost that these folks were exposed to. And just to sort of help us shortcut what that means, you can think of these as actual percentage change for the dimension of travel behavior for our sample. If there are questions about that, we can go into some of the details here. But what this, well, let's just go through what the findings are. So for our sample, essentially, given the tolls they were exposed to, we saw about a 7% reduction in the total number of trips that were made. And we saw about a 12% reduction in the amount of VMT. And this is across all trip purposes and all households. And we saw other sorts of response in terms of the amount of drive time, so about an 8% reduction in the amount of actual time they took driving. And trip segments, about a 6% reduction. Now these are independent of each other, if you will, right? So you don't have to add them together or try and. They are, think of them as sort of final derivatives or full derivatives, total derivatives of the, they, of course, hide the fact that we saw other kinds of response by trip purpose. So this is sort of a summary. We have the same kinds of observations by trip purpose, and we have the same kind of observations for not the households but themselves, but for the vehicles, for each vehicle within the household, and also for the for all the different workplace locations that these households utilize. So there's a huge amount of behavioral information that's generated, but this is sort of, if you will, the highest level, the aggregate kind of response. Of course, it's important to remember that this is a non-equilibrium setting. These folks, essentially, we expose them to tolls. Those tolls varied by time of day. The objective of time of day variable tolling is that there will be some behavioral response, which will then improve conditions out on the roadways. With improved conditions out on the roadways, then there's an inducement back onto the very roads that were most congested. So we wouldn't expect the final, essentially a set of equilibrium conditions to have quite this magnitude of response. And we'll talk. You'll see that in a minute as we go into some. We've done some work to look at that. So we also can understand important things like value of time, and you know, the sort of the standard way of thinking of value of time has been that value of time. A good approximation is that values of time are approximately 50% of wage rate. I think it was Ken Small about 12 years ago published sort of an article that summarized the existing literature on value of time and said, you know, well, 50% of wage rate is a reasonable assumption, but that depending on the region, depending on a range of things, it could be anywhere from 20 to 100% of wage rates, and which is a pretty wide range. What we found, we were able to directly observe the time money trade-off associated with different trip routing choices. And we're finding a value of time at about 75 or higher percent of wage rate. And so it's higher than what we've been using in most of our analytical tools, our travel demand models. But it's very much consistent with the most recent kinds of findings that are coming out of the only environment which you can, in a controlled way, observe this, which is hot lanes. So the work that Ken Small and Brownstone have done looking at values of time in the SR91 and the I-15 corridors in California have demonstrated the same kinds of magnitudes of value of time. And of course, we did want to look very importantly at departure time response. And this is a little bit complex, but let me see if I can walk you through it. Essentially what we've devised is a probability of moving to a lower toll rate time period, given where the baseline conditions, the typical trip behavior and the baseline conditions started with. So if you were taking a trip and the baseline conditions that was, say, 15 minutes, it was 15 minutes away from the shoulder of a toll rate where it dropped off into a lower tolled condition, our estimate is that you were about 35%. In the experimental tolled environment, you were about 35% probability of shifting into that lower toll rate, period. And of course, the further away you were from that opportunity temporally to move into a different toll rate period, the lower the probability that you would do that. So, you know, we got pretty good. From this, we can do some estimates within our travel demand model because we have a time of day model to see if the time of day model is producing results that are reasonable, that look about the same as this. We're actually demonstrating for the first time that we have a time of day model that looks about right because, frankly, almost nobody has data with which to specify these time of day models. So this is very useful. And then let's talk a little bit about the implications of what we think transit quality or transit availability have for behavioral response. This takes a little bit of explaining. But so for each workplace location, we were able to, since we were stuck with the problem of not observing transit usage, we wanted to still have some estimate of transit service quality that was available to the households as an explanatory variable in the econometric work that led to the elasticities. So and this is most meaningful at the workplace location, and we had workplace models. So for each workplace, we devised a transit accessibility or transit viability measure, which essentially looked at the relationship between the generalized cost of using the transit alternatives that were available to them in our model and the generalized costs of using the automobile. So essentially tell something about how meaningful of an opportunity they have to use transit services. Some folks in our region is, I don't know how it compares to Portland, but I mean there are certainly large portions of our region which have almost no transit service availability whatsoever. So and then we turn that measure of transit viability into a set of we ordinally ranked it. Essentially, we have percentiles of across the workplace locations that indicate from the lowest to the highest measures of transit viability. And the point here is that our base level elasticity of tours or of trips, either way you think about it, for the workplace location was about negative 0.04, so about a 4% reduction at the workplace location in actual trips in response to the tolls. And that goes up when you look at households with higher transit viability measures, but it only goes up really meaningfully as you approach, above the 90th percentile in that transit viability measure. And so, and this is a big issue in tolling, right? Because there are always debates about how you use those toll revenues, and also what alternatives need to be available before you can implement tolling, in order to make sure there's not it doesn't appear to be punitive. And a lot of the debate is around how much of that money or what kinds of quality transit services you need available. And essentially, what we're demonstrating is it's not a meaningful factor in for many of these households, but it becomes a very, very, very meaningful influencing factor if you have very good quality transit service. And frankly, then you have to ask yourself, where are you going to be able to have very good quality transit services? And certainly not everywhere. That's just not possible. So, it's a little bit of a way to help us think more meaningfully about the question of how you relate transit service issues to toll implementation. So let's talk a little bit about what we think the implications for road management are, because obviously there's a huge amount of information, more information about the behavioral analysis that we could talk about, but frankly, we need to once we're done with the basic behavioral research, we need to make this meaningful in the context of what are the implications for actually managing a roadway network with tolls like this, say. And so, we obviously operated a tolling system to support the experiment, but that didn't give us full insight into the question of what would it take to implement a system like this at some scale. So we did do some work with Siemens, who was the vendor in this case, to help us understand how you might implement a system completely. There obviously is no proposal to do that, but you can't meaningfully talk about, say, the benefits of doing this without also understanding the costs. And you need to talk about in order to talk about the costs, you need to at least have some vision of how it would be implemented and whether it was practical. So, this is the basic sort of block diagram of how it would work. It's the back office, and the tolling portion of this is exactly like we implemented, just at a much larger scale. There's the same thing with the central system, but the enforcement side, of course, takes some thinking, and you need some stationary enforcement. With a GPS toll system, you are going to need some kind of roadside equipment in order to support basic enforcement. It doesn't need to be everywhere, but it needs to be in some key places, and it needs to be, and you probably need some mobile enforcement as well. The big debate in toll system design in the future is going to be how much on the roadside and how much in the vehicle. And you can't. The point here is you can't simply avoid the roadside entirely. You have to be able to deploy things in the road. And so we have an overall architecture. We have a document that sort of describes how this would be implemented, and then a cost estimate that's built on that. And so here's a sort of breakdown of the cost. Now, this is extremely conservative. I think there was some interest in the question of how much these devices cost, and the devices that we used were probably about $350 when we when we implemented this system in, which was almost 5 years ago when we started. And already the costs are, we estimated here in our cost estimate, $200 a unit. That's too high, frankly. They're lower than that. And at any scale, I think the expectation is they would be lower than $150 a unit. Now that's still a lot more expensive than a toll tag, which can cost anywhere from $10 to $40, depending on the specific technology. But those costs are declining, are coming down all the time. The Dutch are probably the most doing the most work in this, as they look to sort of implement a system. They're trying to implement a system like this at a national scale by 2016. So the other big cost component here is on the operating side, and that's to send the data to the back office through the cellular network. We estimated in our cost estimate here essentially that it would be costs almost like rack rates for data transmission, which of course, if you can imagine the number of accounts, you can't really imagine that you would pay retail rates on data transmission, or there would probably be a strategic interest in the part of some telecom in being part of some vendor system. So the costs are very conservative, but they're not small, and they wouldn't be small in terms of any kind of real implementation anyway. Just installing the devices is a costly and laborious activity. So it's a non-trivial amount of cost to implement. But we also wanted to understand, we wanted to understand cost because we were going to compare cost to benefits. And to compare cost to benefits, we needed to be able to understand the way in which the road system would perform if you implemented this on some scale as opposed to with just 275 households. And so we did some modeling, some network modeling, essentially replicating exactly the toll structure in our model, doing some things in the modeling. We've got a fairly sophisticated standard aggregate model, which isn't ideal, but it does a pretty good job for tolling. And essentially at the network level, we see about a 7% reduction in VMT. We'll compare that to the roughly 12% in our sample base, and that's consistent with the notions that we've improved the conditions out on the roadway, induced people back in the model, and induced people back to use their vehicle once again. So we're seeing some time of day shifting. We're seeing a very small amount of mode shifting. And that's not, frankly, we weren't entirely surprised by that, but the mode shift response is pretty small. And I'll give you a sense here, see if that's readable to you, but just some examples. I'm struggling with this a little bit, but with some examples of travel time in minutes between different locations. If you're familiar with our region, you'll see examples, say, driving. This is again from the model, and this is for the PM peak period, just for the drive alone work trips. But if we're driving, in fact, I just did this. I drove from Seattle to Tacoma. Of course, it was in the morning, and it wasn't a problem. But in the driving home, if you live in the Tacoma area or in the Pierce County area in our region, and you work in Seattle, that's a notoriously bad commute. So our model is saying, and this is pretty well calibrated to baseline good observed conditions, that it might take you around 68 minutes to drive that, and on an average weekday. And under the tolling scenario, we get that down to under 40. So they're not small amounts of time savings when you implement tolling at this scale. And of course, the modeling was then used to support a benefit cost finding. We have a benefit cost tool that we've just had built for us by Eco Northwest. It sits on the back end of our travel demand model, and we can do benefit cost analysis. And there's a question, so I'm going to stop.
I was just going to ask on that previous slide if that was at equilibrium, or you've already factored in some people going back to using the road because the time is reduced.
Yes. So the models are complex, and there are 4 or 5 steps in them, in our sort of what we call a 5-step model. But it is an equilibrium condition, essentially. It's a short-run equilibrium condition because our experiment was short-run. And what that means is we didn't feed the toll rates back into trip distribution, which would realign origins and destinations, and so, or would be our closest approximation of what might happen in the long run in terms of land use. And we didn't do that because we didn't want to show the long-run response. We were trying to replicate the findings of our experiment, which were short-run. But the assignment process and mode choice, those iterate back and forth so that they iterate sufficiently to get to an equilibrium. Yeah. So basic benefit cost findings. Substantial user benefits in terms of travel time savings, substantial benefits in other areas like improved reliability and operating cost savings. But of course, folks are paying tolls, and that's to the user that's a cost. Then, of course, to an operator that's a benefit. The bottom line is we implemented benefits and costs over about a 30-year implementation period. And have about $28 billion over that period in net benefits, which is about a 6-to-1 benefit-cost ratio. So it's a pretty substantial economic argument. Of course, that's not the only argument one might make in terms of thinking about whether this was a useful thing to do. So we also have estimated revenues. Revenues are high. They're about certainly over $2.5 billion a year in our region. That compares to our region's share, if you will, of the fuel tax, which is about $500 million. So those are sizable revenues, and they're probably more than you would want to generate unless you were also reducing other taxes and fees, which is obviously would be something you would be very interested in looking at. And of course, it's a more costly system to implement. I mean, to collect revenues from the proceeds from the fuel tax is almost zero. I mean, it's less than 1% of proceeds. And what we're looking at here is between 5 and 8% of your revenues coming in, at least in our conservative estimate of cost, of operating cost. 5 to 8% of your proceeds are coming in, are being dedicated to the operation of the system. But maybe more importantly than just the amount of revenues is that with a system like this, we know where we're generating revenues. And, it's not like the fuel tax where you don't know where your revenues are coming from. You don't know which roads to invest in necessarily, except using some engineering rules, because you don't know what roads are valued. But we do under a system like this. This is from the experiment, but you can get the same thing out of the model. But we could tell you exactly which links in the network are generating the most revenues, and in fact, we're finding that about 5% of the centerline miles in our tolled network we're generating over about half the revenues. And at first blush, you sort of say, well, maybe that means all you need to do is toll key roads, and you can ignore the rest of the network. But the other half of the revenues are pretty broadly distributed across the urban network, and obviously there would be fairness issues if you simply only collected revenues on some portion of your network. And there would be that implies there would be probably significant diversion. There certainly is diversion opportunity, and so we would expect if you tolled your freeway network, you'd have significant diversion on your arterials, which is probably an undesirable thing. This obviously has implications for investment policy. Where you're generating revenues, arguably, people are willing to pay for improvements. Probably ignoring that information would be unwise. It's currently what we do, because we don't know this information, so we can't do anything else but ignore it. But under a system like this, you have very, very explicit information about where you might need to make the revenues in your network. And of course, we did ask some opinions of people on issues like revenue. Compared to sort of the harder empirical work that was involved in this project, you sort of have to question. I'm not a big fan of these kinds of questions, but how do you feel about paying for your investments with toll revenues or other sources? And the meaningful thing is here we asked these questions before we started the experiment to the same folks, and then after, and they did, become more positively inclined towards tolling, at least it appears, as a consequence of having been involved in an experiment like this. But I don't want to make too much of that. We also asked the same questions, another question about privacy. How concerned are you with privacy? And this one's, it's also one of those scales, 1 to 7, and everybody interprets those differently, so you don't want to make too much of this. But it's sort of interesting finding is that the average response before and after was the same. All we did, I think, is help people think more clearly about the issue. As a response to this question, a response to the experiment, they said they were either more or less concerned about privacy. Well, that's probably good. They understood it better. They were no longer as ambivalent about the question as they were before. But so let's talk a little, just sort of wrap things up because I want to give some time for questions. Pretty simple sorts of conclusions, in a very complex project. But there's clearly a huge opportunity to make improvements in the way in which we operate our road network through this kind of toll system. And both in terms of immediate sorts of congestion reduction, but in terms of long-run investment policy. And so these relate to our core objectives up front, right, which was to understand user behavior and its implications, to sort of look at the issues of toll technology, and then to consider some other aspects of policy. We go into much more detail in our reports on all these factors. But on the technology side, we really did. We were part of essentially a proof of concept for this kind of a toll system. Now it's operational in terms of heavy vehicles, but we were probably the first environment in which this kind of toll system applied to the arterial network, and it worked extremely well. Of course, we didn't demonstrate all aspects of this enforcement, whole range of things. There's huge numbers of issues to resolve around how you would deploy a toll system like this if you ever chose to. But the basic core technology is sound. And then issues of privacy, we talk about them in our reports a bit, and fairness and mostly questions of fairness also have to do with how those revenues get used. You'll notice in the benefit cost results, as a standard, the tolls are a cost to the user and a benefit to the operator. That, of course, also presupposes that you use those toll revenues in some useful way. And if there's anything that this highlights, which we already knew, but it's important in policy, is that it's really, frankly, all about how you use those revenues. And so thinking about whether this is a kind of a system that anybody would want to deploy in a U.S. market is dependent upon all of those aspects of policy, and most importantly, some clear articulation of what you do with the revenues, whether they are a replacement for existing taxes and fees, whether they're dedicated to transportation purposes, probably, of course, whether they're focused on individual corridors in which the revenues are generated, whether they can support alternatives to road use, a whole range of things. But I'm going to sort of open it up to questions because I know that we're going to otherwise run out of time. So.
And I want to remind everyone to use the microphones if they're near you, and if there isn't one near you, Professor Bertolucci is going to come around with a portable microphone for our people webcasting.
So, we got one.
I have a question about the technological upgrade in the 30 years to come. So what will be, in a sense, the adaptation to new technology that eventually is going to appear? And if I understood each and every vehicle will be involved in it in terms of the GPS part of it. I don't even go into the other side, but the GPS part of it becomes kind of a matter of scale. If we see changing in technology, very much is going to happen, probably, we assume, in the next year to come. So that I don't think I've seen that cost somehow analyze it.
Well, I think that I'm hearing a range of questions. So let me see if I can think about this a little bit. In the environment of electronic toll collection, there's multiple technology is evolving across a range of different directions. There's standard, there's the kind of toll collection technology that's in use right now, a short-range communication between a little reader card in the vehicle, or a little card in the vehicle and the roadside, right? But frankly, that's an evolving technology as well, right? So it's 900 megahertz going to 5.8, 5.9 eventually, maybe in Europe, maybe in the U.S. So that's a whole area of evolution in itself. And then there's this question of whether you actually have the functional elements of the toll system in the vehicle itself, which relies essentially upon GPS. And the premise is you would do that if your road network was large enough that you couldn't affordably instrument your whole road network with roadside equipment. It is not a foregone conclusion what direction this moves. Nobody outside of heavy vehicle use right now has deployed a GPS toll system at any scale. So for heavy vehicles, yes, but for passenger vehicles, no. Primarily because of the installation issues. And the Dutch will be the first if they do it. The costs are going to have and continue to come down dramatically. Essentially, in a GPS toll device, there's, depending on how you configure it, there's 3 or 4 different chipsets. They all cost about $20 right now, and there's a little bit of plastic. But installing it can cost, depending on, could cost you as much as the device itself. So the real thinking has been, well, do these elements, does the functionality exist in the vehicle independent of a dedicated toll device? And lots of people are counting on that. I think that is, my own personal feeling is that may be a foolish thing to hope for, because for it to support toll operations, it has to be a trusted environment. And that means it depends on who's operating the toll system. Is that set of functions secure in a way for toll transactions that they're comfortable with? And if you just have a GPS chipset in the vehicle you buy, and your cell phone or whatever else interacts with that, or you have a GSM chip in the vehicle as well, and you've got an onboard computer, are they integrated in a way that essentially results in a trusted tolling environment? And it's not clear to me that in fact will happen, or that it would happen in a way that will make it more affordable in the vehicle than it would be to have a dedicated toll device. I don't know if that's sort of getting at your question, but
it's not readable. It seems to understand to me, that's what I understood, is, well, technology is going to change and we're just going to adapt. The main idea is this way. I just remember, coming from Europe, I remember toll system.
Yes.
And the newest highways that have been made in Spain, those toll systems have been taken out. Yeah. While they remain in France and they are in Italy, but in this case they are privatized highways, so they're quite different. So there are different approaches even in Europe about the specific things. And just to add, the GPS system I remember in Italy, is optional, means you could eventually, like the Easy Pass in New York, but it's always localized, so you have a gate, while this one probably is.
Yeah, we'll have to watch what the Dutch do, because frankly it'll be the first time that anybody will implement something at some real scale, so go.
Yeah, just a question on enforcement, and I guess maybe a definition, maybe clearing up. Enforcement being different from implementation. Would enforcement be follow, I mean, do you imagine enforcement being along the lines of, if your vehicle is registered in this county, you must have one of these devices in your car? That kind of thing? Or is it just more of, we want to implement this system, how do we do that?
So those are all questions that I think would be resolved in, if someone was really serious about deploying a system like this, you'd have to obviously at a high level of detail resolve those. What we did for our architecture, so we created an implementation architecture only really to support a cost model. So the implementation architecture made assumptions that essentially were the most conservative assumptions from a cost perspective that we could. And so we assumed that 90% of the vehicles that were in our region would have a tolling device, because frankly that was the most costly way to estimate the implementation costs of the system. But you're always going to have occasional users, and so you have to have an occasional use system which doesn't have a toll device in it. And it could always be an option for anybody, frankly, to use an occasional use program. You typically want to make your occasional use programs more expensive to use, otherwise people use them, and they're more expensive to operate. So there's a balance, and all aspects of enforcement, there's a balance. And so the other part about enforcement is that you can defeat these. You can defeat any device at some level. So you have to have a way to associate road use with vehicles, at least in a set of spot locations and with some mobile enforcement, independent of the toll device. And so our assumption is you have fixed gantries at key locations, primarily the highway network, and you deploy mobile enforcement. And all of those then are basically some variant of reading license plates and associating those with a registration database. And there are lots of issues with that, and there's lots of, what do you do with out-of-state licenses where you don't have an agreement with those states for how you deal with the billing and things like that. There's lots of things, but
No, I just wanted a little bit of clarification on that, because the system would be very complex at that point,
and it's costly, and we demonstrate that. I mean, in current assumptions, it's not like collecting gas tax.
Right.
We have, I think, 2 wholesale locations in our state. So there are 2 places the state goes to get their gas tax proceeds. That's pretty easy.
I'm curious about the equilibriums that you were talking about, the elasticity, and how you realized that obviously people would shift as the roadways, the travel and time became better. I'm curious about the financial incentive that you gave the sample group and how you compensated for that in those elasticities.
For the financial incentive itself?
Because, I mean, they were obviously incented to reduce the times, or shift the times to times when the toll would be less.
Correct. So so let me see if I may not understand it correctly, but see if I can answer. Essentially their travel budget was set such that if they didn't modify the dimensions of their behavior at all, they would essentially exhaust the endowment account. So anything they did to avoid the tolls they would have paid in the baseline setting during the experiment, that gave them the opportunity to preserve a portion of their travel budget and take it home, if you will. If the question is, does that have an effect on behavior, having a budget, it probably does. It has an income effect. But, frankly, it's pretty small if you think I mean, the income effect of having a few $100s in an account compared to whatever your total income is, I don't want to say it's unimportant, but it's small compared to what we would see as the substitution effect in this sense. So it probably does. The real question we've had lots of people ask is, of course, well, this isn't real money. Wouldn't behavior be different if they were paying their own money? Of course, from our perspective, it is real money. We populated an account for them. We said, this is yours. If you don't spend it, you take it away. If they didn't believe us, then there was very little incentive for them to modify their behavior. And so if they, for whatever reason, didn't believe us that we were going to give them this money at the end of the experiment, then if anything, we've underestimated the behavioral response, or we've failed to observe some behavioral response that otherwise would be there. But I don't think that was a big, I really don't think that was a big issue. Got lots, we get one in the back, and then we'll go around again.
My question is sort of along the same lines with the financial incentives, is that people, if this type of system were to be implemented, I think that, first of all, it's an excellent system in that the more you use the system, the more you pay to support the system, which I think is a really good, I think it's a really good idea. But my question is people, I think people would change their behavior more if they had to pay significantly more money for driving, and that the paying at the different rates for different times, people can only do so much to adjust, right? If you start work at 8 o'clock, you can't drive to work at 1 o'clock when the rate is lower. You have to go to work at a certain time. So I guess what my question is how will the financial incentives for real users, if the system were to be implemented, be explained to the users to say, if you took transit, you could save this much, or if you were able to leave like 10 minutes earlier for work, you would be able to save this much. Is that coming across?
Well, for most toll systems, you actually don't have to explain that to people because they understand. If they pay if they pay the toll, that's income foregone. And but I think the question, part of the question I think is, in the real world, there's both sort of immediate, short-run opportunities to economize, and then there are constraints in the short run. And then there are other things that we believe would happen that didn't happen in the course of an 18-month experiment. And those sorts of long-run responses give people greater opportunity to avoid the toll costs over time. So they may change their home location or something, or a range of other things happen. And so the point there is, I think, those kinds of long-run responses would then have implications for toll rates. So you have to have, you either have to go through an exercise of estimating the long-run response and get the long-run toll rates, right? But that's not really the toll policy. The toll policy is short-run marginal cost. So, or you have to permit those toll rates to be adjusted on a relatively regular basis.
So just quickly, I want to add. I would assume that doing a road toll would take the place of like a gas tax type of thing, and the gas tax is something that I think most people are aware of, but don't really pay attention to because it's added into the price of gas. Whereas this is something that you would see all the time. Were you able to get any sort of conclusions as to the more significant effect of being able to see how much you're paying versus having to run a calculation after you fill your car up?
Yeah, we asked folks the following question. Basically, was we asked them a range of questions about how they used information that we provided them, and there was no obvious answer to the question of how folks gained information about the tolls they were paying. There seemed to be a relatively even split between people who regularly relied only upon what the device was telling them immediately, which was, here's your toll rate right now, here's what you're paying at this very moment, versus people who said that after a while they just ignored that device and they just looked at the monthly invoices, because as long as they were in the target of what they had thought was a reasonable amount per month, they weren't going to pay any attention to what they did on a daily basis. And then there were people who used the online account whenever it was appropriate to do so. And it's very consistent with the way people, I think, use other kinds of billing information. Is for a while they pay a lot of attention to the details, and then after a while they're sort of, you know what, I'm not going to worry about this. I'm going to check my monthly invoice. And different people had different experiences that way. And I think that, what's important is that providing people information in multiple ways is probably the answer. And that has real implications for technology, because the big issue in privacy with the GPS toll system is that you're sending data somewhere, and you're sending a lot of detailed data. And if you that requires you to calculate that information in the toll device itself. And that means you've got a distributed processing environment. It's a little more complex. There's more, but there may be an opportunity to economize in data transmission if you process everything and summarize in the device and send only summary data in the back office. So there's a lot of issues there, but having that ability to give people immediate feedback in the vehicle is probably important. Let's get some folks who haven't had a chance, then we'll come back to other folks. Sure.
When you were designing the sort of the geographic characteristics of your tolling system, I was wondering if your team considered adding an additional charge for major employment centers like downtown Seattle and Bellevue, and if not, why not? Or
we didn't. We were trying to implement a toll system that charged people essentially the marginal costs of using roadways, and not to, the area charges London-style sorts of things, or, there's reasons why you do that, but they abstract in meaningful ways from the nature of congestion. London can get away with that maybe because they have a huge amount of, surface congestion right in sort of the core of London on that, we certainly, people will complain in Seattle that there's congestion on the network right in the downtown, but it's nothing compared to London or New York or places where arguably you can have as blunt an instrument as an area charge and have it be somewhat meaningful.
Did you have any problems with the failure to get a GPS signal, and how was that dealt with?
There are always going to be spot locations or temporary conditions under which you fail to get a GPS signal, and so if you fail to get a GPS signal, first of all, you wouldn't match to a tolled network as a user, and so you wouldn't be paying a charge, and so it's an operations risk, if you will. But we excluded a portion of the downtown from the toll network because we anticipated a sort of urban canyon problem in just a very small portion of the downtown, which wasn't as bad as we had anticipated, but we did that anyway. And the big issue in the GPS toll devices is sort of the time to first fix, and so it's the first time you start up after a long period of not using the device, and it has to go through its process of finding out where the heck it is, in the whole on the globe, and then start zeroing in on Seattle. And those for our devices that were the vintage they were. It wasn't a big issue, but it's even less of an issue now. It's every few months there's a new generation of these chipsets coming out which have such significant improvements made. It's more of an issue if you're doing sort of pure VMT type tolling, where knowing that as soon as you get out of your driveway, you're starting a charge. For the most part, that was not the case that we dealt with, because there was a small portion of the roadway network, the road that leads right to your driveway, that wasn't part of the toll network. It was the main arterials and the freeway network. By the time you got on an primary arterial, there was no problem. We had you fixed.
Your charging approach is really based on the time of day, and you were saying that the cost was for the usage of the road. What about the direction? You've got those costs based on the time of day, but not necessarily the direction, because you might have flow that's opposing that.
Yeah, so our toll rates did not differentiate by direction on the freeway network. And in a real implementation, you probably would want to. We looked at that issue pretty closely as we started this, and we have some key corridors where that's where there's large directional flow, and then we have other key corridors where it's really balanced directional flow. Surprisingly, I mean, it's sort of been the last 10 years that that's really happened. But it was going to be one more dimension to try and represent to people in a meaningful way for them to process. For the experiment, that's not a problem because it actually gives us, it affords us even greater opportunity to observe a variability across the cost conditions that these people were exposed to, both time and money costs. But in implementation, you probably can't avoid that. You have to have some treatment of directionality where it's a meaningful factor. And the system can permit that. It's just really about how much the human brain can process as information in some graphic or other format that you present it to them. So we've got a couple here, and then we'll come back here.
Actually, I think partly a comment and then a question, and getting back to the statement that, you know, people, if they start work at a certain time, they can't necessarily shift their time. And I guess a point to maybe emphasize is that a small portion of people's travel is to and from work. It's usually only about 20% of trips. But I noticed, and if I remember correctly, when you showed the graph that was the transit levels of service around the worksite location versus their change in behavior, the average for change, the line that you had, if I interpreted it correctly, it was for work trips, and it was a lower elasticity than your overall change, which indicates that people were making more behavioral changes on non-work trips. So is that what you found, or?
You know, I have to go look at the tables again that we have, the detailed tables. My recollection is that there is slightly lower elasticities for the home to work and the work to home, which are our work trips. But remember, of course, for the most part, those also are associated with much lower much higher toll rates for those work-related trips, because they're typically, not always, but more typically in those peak travel periods. But the other thing to remember is that the unit of analysis in these we looked at a number of units of analysis. So the household was treated as a unit of analysis, the vehicle was treated as a unit of analysis, and then the workplace essentially was treated as a unit of analysis. So when I say the workplace model, I mean that's looking at the workplace, and because there's some, in the case of, say, the obvious example between households and vehicles, because there's some vehicle fungibility, you would expect to see some differences in, say, the implications at the household versus the vehicle. And some of that is, in fact, that there is lower elasticity with those work-related trips, and some of it is just that it's a different model formulation.
I'm just wondering how you quantified the reliability benefits.
Reliability benefits, good. Yes, yes. So we, once again, with the help of Eco Northwest, we've implemented in both the benefit cost tool that we had them build for us, and now, as a consequence of that, actually in the assignment portion of our model, a way to measure reliability benefit, or changes in unreliability, if you will, from one, say, model run to another. And we've done that by associating, looking at actual speed data out on our network and making a statistical association between the average speed and measures of variance in speed. So, and there's a pretty strong shape to that relationship. Once you've done that, you can use and Carl, we can have Carl or others talk about this in more detail, but you can use the math of basically options theory to develop what we think of as a certainty equivalent of the variable condition. So of course our models are average weekday models. They can only have average conditions, but in reality, they're estimated with data from users where variability is a factor. And once we know what that, we assume that they make some judgments about the risk of unreliable conditions, and we can treat that as a certainty equivalent. Becomes a time penalty at various different speed relationships. Carl probably may have something to add.
The thing I was really curious about was, is there some implicit assumption about people valuing a reliable arrival time at some factor related to their value of time? That was the main question.
Carl may help us, but
a little more detail on
use your.
A little more detail on how it was calculated. What we did was we applied the Black-Scholes valuation formula to come up with a speed, given the expected speed and the variance in that expected speed for the particular freeway links. What's guaranteed speed would you consider to be equivalent?
Yep.
And taking into account your value of time. And then we converted that guaranteed speed into a difference in minutes for the link you're on. And that's the component that those minutes are added to generalized cost. And then the same value of time is applied.
Yeah. So in the model, it's converted to a minute, essentially a penalty, minute penalty. In the benefit cost formula, it's directly, in the benefit cost tool, it's directly estimated as a benefit with values of time that are the same as other values of time. And then we got one back here, so you guys and then.
Josh Fisher, I got a two-part question here. You talked about household vehicles and not transportation or big trucks. If this was implemented, how would it affect the big trucks? And I'm also curious, if I understood correctly, I think you said 5.8% of annual income would be spent on tolls, and that might be wrong, but are there economic impact assessments being conducted towards the impact that this will lower household spending and potentially, if you do charge transportation trucks, raise inflation costs of common everyday goods? Are there, is there any accounting of that or the impacts?
Well, so first is that I think 5.8% was the amount of our estimate of the amount of the percentage of revenues or proceeds that would have to be dedicated to the operation of the system. So not the household expenditure, but the household expenditure question is really dependent upon what other taxes and fees you offset, right? So you eliminate. I mean, I think the size of the revenue suggests to us that you can't. This is not something you layer on top of an existing set of fees and taxes for transportation purposes. It's really something that is a replacement for the existing way of financing transportation. And the question about trucks is, in the model we have trucks, and trucks are going to be less responsive, frankly, less response to the same toll rates, and of course they take up more road space on the roadway. One inclination is to say they should be charged at a different rate, but then you also have to consider the fact that any diversion you do create onto the secondary network actually has a much larger cost in the secondary network than they do on the primary network because of the heavy vehicles imposing such a high damage cost on the road surface. So I think thinking about those toll rates for trucks is a complex other issue to resolve. And the only other thing is benefit cost analysis. We have a benefit cost result. The implication of that is that it's a net benefit to society. So arguably the economy works better. It also, of course, depends on how you use those revenues. But
my question kind of follows that, and basically, it's okay. Do you, in your study, have considered the possibility of toll rate in a discriminatory fashion based on the kind of car, especially when you say that this is going to substitute other taxes, means there is a problem with emission that might arise, means incentive to eventually adopt cars that do not produce as much. There's one part. The other part is in a similar level. has been taken in account by in any way the possibility of having a progressive toll based on income? And I say that because I assume that people that go to work at a specific time, so it means they do not have the flexibility of changing time for the route to their workplace, have generally more, have generally a lower level of income, and less flexibility means in that way that probably a more progressive way of addressing the toll could eventually overcome this kind of problematic
So the questions
aspect.
are related in that the point is, can you achieve other social objectives through your toll policy? And the answer is clearly probably that you could, but not necessarily that you should, in the sense that doing that comes at a cost of reducing the effectiveness of the primary objective. So in this case, if the toll is to internalize the congestion externality or control the amount of congestion on the road network, any exemptions to that or any modifications to that basic toll policy limits the ability to achieve that objective. Now, you may want to do that anyway. Hybrids get exempted, right, in HOT lanes in California. Of course, that's become an unsustainable policy. And, I drove our agency's hybrid down here. I got 47 miles per gallon. I'd say that's a much more significant incentive for me to drive that hybrid than the toll policy is going to be. And I think so the point is that we have lots of things that we want to achieve in policy. There's a tendency to want to mix them all together and have one policy that can achieve all those objectives. Usually, the result of that is predictable. It's that you've limited your ability to successfully achieve the primary objective, and if the other objectives you have are important enough, you probably need policies that specifically relate to those as well. The question about fairness is very important, of course, in this. And it's as much or more about how those revenues probably get used than about who actually pays the tolls. It's certainly, you can't answer one question without the other. If you have a conversation about toll policy without also having a conversation about how revenues get distributed, you're not having a particularly meaningful conversation.
And we're going to have to leave the conversation on that note because we've run out of time. Before we thank our speaker for a really engaging and interesting time, I will let everyone know next week we have Professor Margaret Neal, Director of our Institute on Aging, talking about older drivers in Oregon, factors associated with continuing or ceasing to drive. So I hope we see some of you there, and thank you again, Matthew.